Rob McConnell, and I'm the director of the Southern California Environmental Health Sciences Center and the USC Children's Environmental Health Research Translation Center that co-sponsor this series. The goal is to teach ourselves skills that will help us make sure that our science has more impact, that we communicate the results better, and people who need to hear about the science to make changes do so. If you do a really good job and your science has a lot of impact, if you're in the area of environmental health, then at some point you may gore some special interest ox. And the point of this session is to delve into that a little bit more and to teach you how to respond to it, how to deal with it. The session will be moderated by Dr. Anna Wu, who's a professor of population and public health sciences at USC. And over a long and illustrious career, she's had her doing science with a lot of impact. She's had the occasional brush with vested interests that she may tell you about. I'm going to turn it over to Anna now, who will introduce our speakers, or allow them to introduce themselves, and we'll get started.
Good morning, and thank you, Rob, for the introduction to this last session. As Rob mentioned, I had in my early career, I had a long 1 decade, which seemed very long, in actively dealing with the tobacco industry, in part because of the work that I was doing on passive smoking with John and others. So we have a real treat today in this last session, because we have two real leaders in the field who will share with us their experience, insights of really what to do if your research makes industry or other vested interests mad. I mean, they have decades of experience dealing with not only the tobacco industry, but many other related industries that use similar and different tactics in the way they use to hide whatever the truth is. So I will first ask John and Lisa to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we will launch into this discussion, which will be very interesting, I am sure.
Okay, well, I have unmuted first, so I'll go ahead. So I'm John Samet. It's nice to see lots of colleagues, both at USC and from elsewhere, joining today. I think many of you will have very similar, perhaps, stories or experiences to recount. But as quick background, I'm trained in medicine and public health, and have done epidemiological research on a host of issues that feed into regulatory matters or matters of litigation or of public policy more generally over the decades. And coming out of this is a lot of experiences about what happens when the science leads to actions that someone may like or may not like. And that's what we'll be talking about today. At the moment, I'm at the Colorado School of Public Health, and probably most of you know I was chair of the Department of Preventive Medicine when it held that name at USC from 2008 through 2017.
Lisa?
Great, thanks. I second John. I'm so delighted to be here, and I think this is really important to talk about because it's certainly something I never, learned in school. So I think it's great to get these views aired. I am trained actually as a neuropharmacologist, and I was doing work in a lab, and then I quickly became much more interested in how we used evidence in policy, and that led to an interest in what actually influences the evidence, and that led to quite a long career that I've devoted to studying industry influence on evidence as one of the primary areas of study. So I spent most of my career at UCSF, but then moved to the University of Sydney to start a program in evidence policy and influence. And I think it's one of the still remaining programs. Barbara Mintzes runs it, that's devoted to really looking at commercial influences on research across a variety of commercial interests, as Anna mentioned, pharmaceutical, tobacco, chemical, food. So we've covered that. And now I'm delighted to be at the University of Colorado at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, where I have the pleasure of, again, working with John.
Terrific. So before we start the conversation, just a few housekeeping rules. For participants who have questions, please raise your hand and wait for you to be called. And at the time when you pose your question, please identify yourself as well as your affiliation. And we will try to monitor the chat and figure out as we go along. Okay. So just to get this going, I thought one of the first things that we might want to talk about is really the battle with tobacco and secondhand smoke, because for many of the younger audience, they probably don't know that we used to have smoking on airports, on the planes, at work, literally everywhere. So this transformation in the last 25 plus years is really very remarkable. So I think it will be really of great interest for both John and Lisa to tell us a little bit about really your experience. I mean, I'm sure this is going to take could take hours. So, just to give us some highlight of some of the lessons and battles that you encountered, and also how this has helped you learn some of the strategies and other battles. So Lisa and John, either one can start with the.
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I actually started out looking at pharmaceutical industry tactics to influence research, and then started applying those same things to tobacco. And that's around the time when secondhand smoke was the real issue. There were claims that the evidence was uncertain. And so we were looking at a lot of that work, much of it from the tobacco industry, assessing the quality of the research, how the questions were being asked, and how basically the results were being influenced. And then the tobacco industry documents came along, which gave us kind of an inside view into what was we thought was happening, but gave us really good evidence. Like, the documents would lay out the tobacco industry's plan to suppress a study or to create a study that was going to counter an independent research study. So all of this, you might imagine, generated a lot of criticism of our work, which I know we can get into more detail later, but that included things like, our work being attacked in the scientific literature, people writing letters to my university saying I should be fired, people writing letters to committee chairs saying I shouldn't be on the committee, things like that. And John, I'll let you talk, but I'd like to come back to this point to say how we responded to those criticisms, if I can.
Sure. So, I mean, I think everybody probably understands that if you will, the so-called tobacco industry playbook really dates back to the active smoking days. And I think for those interested in sort of the evolution of causal thinking and epidemiology, should go back and read what people were writing in the 1950s when the observational evidence was so clear that smoking caused lung cancer. Key resource here would be Robert Proctor's book, The Golden Holocaust. And there are others, Naomi Oreskes and David Michael's book. So that sketches out the story. I think when we come to the secondhand smoke story, which really begins in the late 70s into the 80s as evidence emerged, I think what is striking is how systematic the attack was, ranging across all the kinds of evidence that were being generated, systematically attacking individual epidemiological studies, but also the entire discipline of epidemiology, trying to play it out as, quote, soft science. Meta-analysis was used for the summarizing the evidence on lung cancer and secondhand smoke. And there were even attacks on meta-analysis per se when used for that purpose. With my colleague at Hopkins, Tom Burke, we wrote a paper published in the American Journal of Public Health about more than 20 years ago now. The title gives away the story, Turning Science into Junk. And it was about the secondhand smoke evidence. So Anna's challenges at USC were involved in a multi-center case control study of passive smoking and lung cancer, where the effort was to obtain the data. Reanalysis of data remains a key way to nibble away at the scientific foundation, to find flaws or to pool data in ways that, instead of leading to a strong association, carve the data up into little chunks so that nothing comes out. So, the attack was systematic. There were big stakes. The tobacco industry recognized that smoking bans would have huge impact, potentially on their sales, on cessation, and on the social norms. And in fact, we have come a long way.
I just want to jump in and say something about the meta-analysis, John, because that is actually, an area I work in a lot, evidence synthesis. And one of my most cited articles was one we published called Why Reviews on Secondhand Smoke Reach Different Conclusions. And this was actually one of these first meta-research studies that looked at the influence of funding source and outcomes. But what was interesting about that is we gathered up all the published reviews on secondhand smoke at the time, and there were actually more published by the tobacco industry than independent sources, which was kind of interesting. It showed they were really pushing out these reviews. And when we analyzed them, we found that if a review was funded by the tobacco industry, it was about 80 times more likely to conclude that secondhand smoke was not harmful than studies with independent sponsors. And that's when you controlled for things like year of publication, the quality of the review, and things like that. And so that study really showed that industry funders can influence the outcome of a study, in this case, a review.
One further comment on the secondhand smoke story. If you're not familiar with the paper by Dr. Hirayama in Japan, published in 1981 in the British Medical Journal, was published the findings of a cohort study of women showing that non-smoking women married to smoking men had a higher risk of mortality from lung cancer than non-smoking women married to non-smokers. If you look at the British Medical Journal over the next year, there were probably 20 letters to the editor published critiquing the study, some by quite notable individuals in the history of epidemiology and public health, later revealed to be paid by the industry to provide these letters to the editor. And again, systematic in the attack on, in this case, the problems that can face any single epidemiological study, but laid out by a host of letter writers.
This is a nice segue to actually one of the tactics that they use, which is to fund symposiums and fund journals and whatnot. So it's actually very difficult for a researcher to actually know, who's behind what, doing the things that they do. So these indirect tactics that they hide behind, how do you have some insights to share with the younger researchers into what are some of the things to look for? Because I would say that I think the first time I got a grant solicitation from the indoor something, so we were actually invited to participate in things that I actually didn't know were funded by the tobacco industry. So
Center for Indoor Air Research.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The Center
No,
for
actually,
Indoor Air
Anna,
Research,
let
which
me,
is funded by 5 tobacco
Yeah.
companies.
Yeah. Let me refresh Anna's memory. She was an author for the 1986 Surgeon General's report, which was Dr. Koop's report on involuntary smoking. And myself and Dave Burns were the principal editors putting this document together. And most of our authors were invited to a symposium at Georgetown, which turned out to be funded by the tobacco industry, I think in an effort to have the authors perhaps discuss or reveal the directions that their chapters might be taken. And this was outed by Judd Wells, who was a figure that some of us remember, who was a sort of a consultant to the American Lung Association. You may have heard later from the Center for Indoor Air Research, which, as Lisa pointed out, was industry funded.
Yes, I think after a while, they also stopped sending me those invitations to submit a grant.
Well, we did a little study on the Center for Indoor Air Research, which actually was part of a court case that eventually disbanded that center. And basically, they had kind of 2 streams of funding. And one was a peer-reviewed stream where most of what they funded was not related to secondhand smoke. So basically, it was this idea of funding distracting research, like whether having a green plant in your office or whether having carpet off-gassing was harmful. And they would use those studies actually to say that, oh, carpet off-gassing is more important than secondhand smoke. We should be focusing on other aspects of indoor air. Then they had a non-peer-reviewed track that was much more secret, and those were approved by their board. And those were the studies that focused on secondhand smoke. And those studies did not appear in the peer-reviewed literature. They were used mostly in litigation. That's where they would appear. But I see your point, Anna, like, how do you know as a researcher? I mean, one thing when I talk to folks today, they say, oh, well, every study now has a funding disclosure, and it is true that has gotten a lot better. I mean, it's hard to believe, but 20 years ago, studies didn't even have funding disclosures. So that's gotten better, but still, you need to ask questions. Whenever I get approached by a foundation, we've got foundations now that are changing their names all the time. I always ask, what is their decision-making process? Because you want to know if the industry lawyers or industry scientists are involved in that. And then you want to know who's funding the foundation.
So just to continue a little bit on the smoking history, how do you see the current? I know that vaping is currently included in some of the tobacco bans, but how do you see this playing out given that the tobacco industry continued to have all kinds of products that are being introduced all the time now? And how do you actually monitor them? How do you regulate them? How do you actually study the long-term risk? I mean, it's just a landmine in terms of what's the next steps for those who are working in tobacco products.
Well, I'll comment. I mean, this is a long and complicated topic, and we may have to get Rob involved a little bit in the discussion too. But just as contextually, the Hanlick patent for the current generation of electronic cigarettes was 2003. So in terms of where we are 2 decades later, we are in a very challenging point from the public health point of view with the proliferation of so many different devices and ways to get nicotine into people, particularly youth, which are of concern. The regulatory landscape here is really complicated because of the 2009 Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. And then in 2016, FDA taking regulatory authority over electronic cigarettes and some other products through the so-called deeming rule. And then not really moving very definitively yet, although there have been a few positives like the limitations on flavors in what is sold over the sold in stores. You know, we're always behind with research on these newer products because it takes us a while to do the research. And in the case of the tobacco marketplace, we have the same problem in the cannabis marketplace. The products are moving forward so fast that our research lags. I think, Rob, maybe you should comment on some of the work going on at USC that has been at the vanguard in providing information and perhaps some of the challenges in generating that information for FDA, which is now sort of the principal user, but also locally.
You're muted.
Thanks. Well, I've had a little bit of involvement with e-cigarettes, and there's quite an active group at USC that's looking at regulatory science with respect to e-cigarettes. You know, it's been a fascinating experience. You know, we've seen an epidemic unfold in front of us. You know, it's been slow motion, but I think it was predictable 10 years ago that it would become an epidemic, and it's been really troublesome and exciting to see how the epidemiology has progressed with sort of increasing evidence that e-cigarettes have harmful effects on health, acute effects, and increasingly potentially chronic effects. And maybe one other, these are sort of random thoughts. I didn't think about these questions, but I think you know, one of the things that's been interesting to me about the evolution of the field is that the tobacco regulatory science 15 years ago was largely the purview of behavioralists. Yeah, I think the consensus at the time was that we needed to do regulation, we needed to do control of tobacco use, we needed to do interventions. We didn't need to know more about health, and I think that's changed dramatically with the advent of e-cigarettes, because it's gotten, as John says, it's just gotten way ahead of the use. The market has gotten way ahead of the health studies, and we sort of probably still need a dramatic infusion of funds to do epidemiology and to do toxicology so that we can understand these exposures better. Yeah, I mean, the other interesting thing about it is that e-cigarettes started out as a disrupting industry for tobacco. It was small shops, small companies, and over the years, it's been the industry has consolidated. Big Tobacco has bought in, owns many of the brands, and the tactics that they're using are the same tactics that they used 50 years ago, that they developed 50 years ago. So it's really the same story, and in some sense we're reinventing the wheel in terms of how to respond to that.
Well,
I just want to follow up on that point about the industry tactics, because it's, you're right, Rob, it's all the same tactics over and over. And the Center for the Smoke-Free World they changed their name recently to something, Global Action to End Smoking. They've been doing a lot of research related to e-cigarettes. And this was the kind of group that initially wasn't very public about who was funding them, which is Philip Morris. And so, and then they had claims that their, review process was independent of the funder. And this is, been shown not to be true. But what's interesting is Testleg, I was just a co-author with Testleg on a very interesting paper, a survey that was done in the UK, asking the public about how much they trusted research on tobacco if it came from different sources. And if it came from, this foundation that's funded by Philip Morris, they actually trusted it more than if it came from the tobacco industry. And that was even when they found out that Philip Morris was funding it. So, these front groups really, they do convey a sense that they're somehow more independent from the industry when they're really not.
We have a question from the audience from Bruce Lamphere, and the question is, John alluded to how scientists have been funded to minimize or criticize research. I am no longer surprised by industry's tactics, but more troubled by how our regulators and colleagues in public health or medicine minimize or dismiss evidence that calls for greater regulatory actions. So he would like you to speak to this problem.
I'll take a first crack. And hi, Bruce. I mean, there's a long history of this. If you go back, notable people in the field have been drawn into work for tobacco and other industries. I mean, R.A. Fisher and Joseph Berkson were early consultants to the tobacco industry, and Clarence Cook Little, who was the original chair of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which became the Tobacco Research Council, had been president of the University of Maine, the University of Michigan, and was the founder of the American Cancer Society. And this continues, and somehow, I don't know that it's the draw of funds or it's being paid and being skeptical, and that combination seems to be an unfortunate one. I will say, so for our academic colleagues, there are some who spend their careers being gadflies, and on some matters, there's general polarization. I mean, I think a good example now is the so-called debate or controversy, I don't particularly like those terms, around harm reduction and electronic cigarettes and heat not burn products. Just to take this a little broader, though, if you move into some regulatory areas, there are consulting firms that essentially line up and work for various industries on matters related to regulation, often critiquing studies, or doing meta-analyses. Lisa can speak to this. I talk about the phenomenon of dueling meta-analysis, where perhaps one has been done by an academic group saying that, X is associated with Y, and here's a pooled estimate. And another meta-analysis, often using more or less the same studies, saying that, gosh, there's no association. And when you do careful quality assessment, risk of bias analysis, we don't really have any good studies here. And those exercises often involve very well-trained people who now use their training essentially to make evidence of risk go away. But Lisa, this is your turf.
Yeah, well, we've done a lot of analyses of secondhand smoke regulation and legislation and the public commentary that was on it. And it was really interesting because, these regulators, OSHA, for example, we looked at OSHA as one of them, they got swamped with public commentary on this, like more commentary than they'd had in history on any topic. And the vast majority of it came from the tobacco industry, which is not, really surprising. But what surprised me is we looked at the arguments that these public commentaries were making, and the tobacco industry was actually making more arguments about the science than the public health comments that were coming in. And they were making arguments about, criticizing the science that was out there, and bringing new science forward that had never been published in peer-reviewed articles. And later when we interviewed regulators about this, they said it put them in a really tough position because all of these fancy binders coming in, and they were just getting swamped with so-called evidence on one side, and it was from the tobacco industry, and they're obligated to respond to it in some way. And they have to actually critique it. So we've done workshops with, judges and policymakers on, how you look at evidence, how you would resolve those conflicting meta-analyses, for example, or like how to really go to evidence that's from a trusted source. But usually they have to actually critique the evidence in some way. And so folks need to have the skills to do that. And, I think sponsorship, when it's obvious, can help people sort through that, but usually they can't use sponsorship as a way to rule out looking at evidence. And Bruce, I don't know the answer to your question. Like, I think part of it's resources, that the public health community was just not as active in these regulatory proceedings as the tobacco industry. They've got a lot of money behind them. This happens in other areas as well, chemical areas. But I just always plead with all the students and colleagues in public health that, it's really worth it to get involved and spend your time responding to things like public commentary, testifying for regulators, meeting with regulators.
What about the role of community involvement in any of these battles? Since there's a lot more, whether it's citizen science or, all the things on the internet, how do you see these other entities' involvement or maybe even more distracting in terms of the conversation?
Well, we've been doing some work around what are called patient groups and patient support groups that are often sponsored by, or funded, I should say, by pharmaceutical companies. So I think it's just like you were talking about, research foundations that fund people. You got to know who's funding these groups. I mean, interestingly, in the US here, we have the open payments database where pharmaceutical companies and device companies have to disclose what they're paying to doctors in terms of money, consulting fees, food, any material value. And in Australia, there's a database like that, but it also includes payments to consumer groups. And we saw that, the pharmaceutical companies support a lot of these consumer groups, and that some of the messages coming out of these groups can really align with pharmaceutical industry messages. So, I think, so for a lot of these consumer and patient groups, it's just worth investigating, where their funding is coming from, and is it diversified funding? Because again, they're not always independent of industry.
And I'll just chime in. I've been thinking in general comment on this question of sort of citizen science and how it helps inform things. I think the easy answer is the usual dodge. It depends. And I will say in the world of air pollution, there's now a lot of devices that people are using, Purple Air and others, that do provide some data. I've also seen a lot of frustration with these devices because the numbers may not reflect well the actual community concerns. They may be used locally, at least for national purposes at this point. A lot of data that's gathered by sort of non-reference methods may not be admissible. So I think at least around air quality, things are emerging. I will say, and I'll give you an example of how simple evidence can help. When I was at Johns Hopkins, the key to getting Maryland smoke-free was to get Baltimore smoke-free. And key folks in the legislature, and I talked to them often, did not want to take Maryland smoke-free before Baltimore because of the sort of the potential threats to them around public and what industry might say. We sent public health students out with particle monitors on one night, and they measured inside and outside of bars and came up with, big surprise, evidence that bars were far more contaminated with particles than the streets of Baltimore. The students presented this to city council, and Baltimore went smoke-free. That kind of project could easily have been done by a citizen group. I mean, our students were volunteers who used instruments with guidance. So I certainly think that citizen science can be helpful, and I think probably made more helpful if there are good partnerships with academics or others who can provide guidance on various pieces of equipment.
So talking about the student involvement, I guess one of the question is, and I certainly will say throughout my formal academic training, all of this is completely not taught, not even discussed. So how do you see the current curriculum in public health? Whether it's under policy or epidemiology or really just public health students, should have some general classes. Because I remember, at least in the curriculum at UCLA 40 years ago when I was a student, there were sort of these core public health classes that regardless of your major, you have to take. So how does this fit in the current education?
Yeah, I'll take a crack. So some public health curricula are starting to teach courses on commercial determinants of health. And so looking at how corporations influence health, not only through influencing research, which is, of course, the angle I look at, but influences on policy as well, on education, on the whole gamut of public health. And so I think that's a first step, right, is to make people aware that commercial influence is a very, very important in public health. And we need to, understand that it's just not like it's been kind of an undercurrent in everything forever. And, people didn't want to say it out loud for a lot of areas. And so I think that is a first step. I also think, having fora like this, where people can talk about tactics used to counter industry pressure on researchers themselves, is really important. I actually know of a student recently who applied for a fellowship and was told they didn't receive the fellowship because they were going into this very controversial area related to commercial determinants of health, and they thought that might be a risky for a career. And I have to say, all my life I was told, don't do what you do, it's going to be risky for your career. But here I am, still hanging on by my toenails. And I think that people need to understand that if you go and study a controversial topic, you may have pushback, but there are definitely strategies and ways to deal with that pushback. There's support that you can get from your university and from your colleagues. And so I think actually formalizing that kind of education for students would be really, really important, rather than just telling them, oh, don't do that because it's going to be too controversial.
I'll just add, having been actually asked this question many, many times, that probably knowing how to communicate is a key fundamental skill for this sort of move into the translation policy space. And that I think we can help and teach. The kind of experience that you get from stepping into the fray, I think you need to get that experience and learn and perhaps be mentored. The same issues come up not only with students, but certainly with our faculty, and particularly the junior levels. People do want to be engaged. They want to see their work make a difference. And then they're often puzzled about how you actually do that, particularly within the confines of the academic world. And this sort of relates to the question sitting in chat from Elizabeth that, would fit in, I think, well now to discuss. And if you think we could move to that one.
Absolutely, yes.
Because so I will say that that at our school, public health practice, and I'll take that to embrace a lot of things, from ranging from very applied research and problem solving to stepping into translational processes. We are, I think, doing a better and better job at recognizing it. And we've written up case studies, examples for our promotion and tenure materials so that this kind of material can be reflected. I will say that, how institutions handle such materials is highly, highly variable. And I suspect that any institution, somebody who comes in with a strong portfolio of funded research and publications along with decent teaching will be looked at favorably. If you add a substantial focus on practice activities to that and perhaps less funded research and fewer publications, then I think you'll do a lot of institutional variation in how that's handled. I mean, and knowing USC, I often found myself writing letters that explain what people who have a public health emphasis do, because, again, there was a challenge as materials went upwards in the sort of university hierarchy all the way to university-wide committees. And the question of who gets engaged, this sort of, moving down Elizabeth's comment, I think people in part self-select because of who they are and the nature of the research to wander into this translational world.
Yeah, I just add a couple of comments to that, because having been on tons of promotion committees, I think, John is absolutely right. Committees view this kind of activity differently, but a lot of schools now require you to write an impact statement or some kind of statement about your policy activities. And so it does, it does help to actually be able to document that. You have to have the other criteria as well, but it definitely is a plus on the committees I've been on lately at different schools. And I think in terms of, freeing up the time to get involved in these regulatory processes, for example, you can build an infrastructure for that. For example, our program in Sydney, part of our mission was to respond to public commentary requests that were in our area of work. And we did it internationally. We did it for WHO, we did it for Canada, the US, Australia, and we had an infrastructure for that. So we had a part-time staff person who would screen for these calls and who would potentially draft something. And then everybody in the group, from students on to the more senior people, would be able to comment on it. And then we would all sign off on it if we agreed with it. And so we had, those documented, and it was a way for everybody to get involved.
Okay, we have 15 minutes of discussion. I wanted to just make sure that there are no other comments or questions from the audience, and then I'm going to sort of ask my next question if there are. Oh, Rob, okay. You're muted.
So I have a couple of questions that I think have been raised by the discussion that we just had. One's a comment, and that's, I think if you're a scientist and you see different aspects of the problem that you're interested in, if you see it from a research standpoint, if you understand it from a public health practice standpoint, if you're forced to communicate your message in a way that policymakers or the general public understands, that you understand the topic better. You get different insights into it. I think in particular, I've had the occasional, nothing like John's experience, but I've had the occasional opportunity to participate in a legal proceeding. And being on the witness stand really makes you sharpen your arguments. And I think you really need to understand the epidemiology to do it. So I would argue that you know, you have to face the A&P committee, but these other activities help you be a better scientist and help you understand better the problem that you're investigating. And then I have one question, I guess, in particular to Lisa, but maybe to the whole group, and that's, you know, this variation between universities in how people are treated if they're attacked. And you, Lisa, gave a particular example that worked out quite well. I know there are other people on the call who've had experiences that were a much bumpier ride. I wonder if you could comment.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, because I think this is really, really important, because if you are doing, you know, critical public health research, probably at some point in your career, you're going to get attacked. And, you know, my take-home message here is whenever that happens, try to take it public. And I'll give you an example of when that works well and actually when it didn't work well for me. So it doesn't always work. But so when I was probably 6 months into my, you know, first non-tenured position at UCSF, someone wrote a letter about an article I had published to the dean and to the head of my institute and said I should be fired for doing unethical research due to this paper. So I get called in. I'd never even met the dean. And, you know, I was pretty scared. And the dean said, so I've got this complaint about your paper saying I should fire you because you're doing unethical research. And I see the paper was published in New England Journal, which is true. It was on drug industry symposia. And he said, was it peer reviewed? And I said, yes. And he goes, okay, well, I am going to write this person and tell them if they have any criticisms of your work, they should write the journal. And that was such a light bulb for me, because I realized you want to take these criticisms out into, you know, open scientific discourse. Interestingly, that person never wrote to the New England Journal. That was the last we heard of that person, well, for a few years. Now, once I had published a paper in a different journal, and someone wrote the editor and said that the paper should be retracted because of our inappropriate statistical tests. Now, we had a statistician on the paper, went back and forth with the editor who wanted us to hire another statistician to do a reanalysis. Our statistician took great umbrage with the suggested stats and said ours are correct. And so I said to the editor, look, I want to just take this public. You have an open comment system. Let this person submit this rather than requesting a retraction internally. Let them submit it to the journal and we'll debate it in public. And the editor wouldn't do that. But the editor did drop the retraction request. But I think in that case, it would have been much more valuable to get it out in public. And I have to say, I've always worked at a public institution. And so I've always had very good luck with my institutions supporting me in a very public way. But I think, you know, if you can debate this, you know, in the open scientific forum, and you're doing good research, so you're on, you know, good ground.
I'll just comment. I mean, again, I think I've been generally well supported. When I was at Johns Hopkins, we were involved with the Minnesota tobacco litigation, several other states, and then later the Department of Justice. And I can't remember at what point Johns Hopkins was subpoenaed by the tobacco industry for all documents related to all research done on tobacco at Johns Hopkins across its history. Now you can imagine that's an unanswerable request, but the lead counsel, Estelle Fishbein, basically went to the New York Times, got a story published about tobacco industry harassment of academia. I will say I've had a recent experience. I'm at a public institution, so my emails are obtainable through the Colorado Open Record Act. And I just went through a round of 3 requests for my emails and had actually very good support from our campus legal team on dealing with this and minimizing the scope of what was provided. I will say when I became involved in the tobacco industry litigation, I did meet with the counsel for the university to just get guidance and to alert them that I was going to do this, and that probably inevitably there would be some sort of response by the industry that might require their involvement.
Well, I have to say, certainly the USC lawyers, when I was forced to turn over documents from our case control study, was much less supportive. Essentially, their take was turn over the data. And so I would say that it is highly varied in terms of what type of protection you get from the institution for various things. Now, there is one more comment or question in the chat. This is from Carlos Santos Bogia, and he said, I think he's either still on the call or maybe leaving. He said this is a very important in general for all students and practitioners. We have to tell our students and mentees about predatory journals. The same we should do with predatory foundations or sources of funding, especially with the scarcity of funding for certain topics or in certain countries.
I think I would only say agree.
Yeah, I agree. And it's tough that you can't take a foundation for face value, actually, but it is worth doing a little digging so you avoid being subject to these predatory foundations.
I mean, at the start, Lisa mentioned the Philip Morris funded Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, which was the first president or director was Derek Yock, who had been the leader of the tobacco-free initiative at WHO and very involved in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And many of us signed on to, schools of public health signed on to an agreement that we would not accept funding. And with others, I arranged for an editorial in the major respiratory journal on this, and the Journals of the American Thoracic Society signed on to not publishing work supported by this particular foundation, as it did not publish tobacco industry funded work. And there's a confusing landscape now. I mean, Lisa, you might comment on some of our work around cannabis and the complexities there and the funding landscape.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting area because, I mean, we have obviously cannabis companies and cannabis growers. That's an obvious conflict of interest if you're doing research on cannabis, but a lot of pharmaceutical companies are also doing research on cannabis and could, potentially have a commercial product related to cannabis that's from a pharmaceutical company. But interestingly, this also happened with pharmaceutical and tobacco companies. We did an article a long time ago showing that tobacco and pharmaceutical companies collaborated in that tobacco companies were selling them a lot of the IP or intellectual property they had on nicotine, and then the pharmaceutical companies could then create like nicotine patches and products to treat addiction. And I mean, to me, not only was this a conflict of interest in terms of research, but it was such an irony that a company would profit from creating the addiction and treating it as well, right? So, and it's really, really just one other complication is mergers and acquisitions among these companies are just, going on all the time. And actually, tobacco companies have shared with food companies. This is work of Laura Schmidt at UCSF showing that they shared their strategies for marketing to children. The tobacco companies shared that with the food companies. And so not only were they sharing science, but marketing strategies as well. So yeah, it's complicated, but I kind of always make the assumption that there's something going on behind anything that calls itself independent. It's worth checking.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, John.
I was just going to we're heading towards the wrap up, but I just want to make a couple of quick sort of general comments. And one will be that if you sort of step out of the tidy world of doing research and publishing it and then going on to do the next project. There's a couple of things you just have to be ready for. And I think one is that if you do something that's meaningful, you may, and I use the word, quote, make enemies. And you can think about that as perhaps a badge of honor if you make the right enemies. And I think going with that is, you just have to be prepared to have a thick skin. And, going back to Lisa's experience with her paper long ago, it's not about you as an individual. It's about what you've done and what you've accomplished and what the impact may be. And I think just have to keep that in mind. And sometimes when I've published papers, I've sort of had a little bit of a sense of, oh no, but that doesn't mean you don't publish. You just get ready for what may come.
Yep, and my only summary comments are, keep the science strong, because that's what you're going to debate on publicly, hopefully. And also remember, there's a lot of people out there who have been through this and who, are here to help you. John and I are some of them, but, there's always support.
Well, we are 2 minutes left, and I think those are great closing remarks so that we can remember that what is our badge of honor and do something that they actually is going to call us on, which is a good thing. So, Rob, any other additional comments before we close out this hour? It's really a terrific discussion, and I really appreciate the opportunity and that John and Lisa took their busy schedule to spend this hour with us.
Yeah, I would echo that. Thank John and Lisa and you, Anna. And this is our last webinar of the academic year. We're hoping to restart in the fall and hoping to see you back then.
Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and John and Lisa and Dominica and Rob for getting this organized.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.